you for coming out. It's very kind of you to come out. To sort of the thought behind this was more of an ongoing introduction of Sam Hauser to the community, and perhaps some reflections on time at New Roads, and also thinking a little bit about with homage to Paul Cummins and David Rhymes, sort of original founders, but also maybe a snapshot of sort of where collectively we see New Roads right now. And you know, I thought I would just check with the crowd. Does anybody here really consider themselves an expert in progressive ed? Anybody? Okay, all right. Just want to know how much stuff I can make up. And but it's been. I want to thank Sam. I've said it at every public event. This is sort of probably my last sort of major event within the school context, and somewhat Sam's first as he sort of takes flight here. So how lucky we are to have you. And I look at among this crowd, and many of you were here in the first weeks, sitting where you were sitting 2 years ago, with the same look of skepticism. So it's great to have you here. Really, the intent here was for us to go a little back and forth about education as we sort of, through the lenses we've traveled during our, I guess, collective 70-plus years in education. And then talk a little bit about how we see that play out here. And then it sort of grew this into sort of a discussion, and then somebody said, well, we'll get questions, and we'll submit questions. And I'm, of course, being confident, as Hank said, no questions. But we're going to have some questions. And so I'll talk for a minute about my background again, and then Sam will talk a little bit about his. And then there are some questions that were submitted, and then maybe we can do some back and forth stuff if stuff comes up that you're interested in talking about, or that some of this resonates with you. And again, we're probably, there's always that Goodwill Hunting moment where Robin Williams says, I teach this stuff, doesn't mean I know how to do it. And when questioned by Matt Damon about, what kind of therapist are you? And but my background, I went to grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll come back to sort of the role that some of the university work there played in the early days of progressive ed. I went to a school that was founded by Harvard professors, for kids of Harvard professors, called the Shady Hill School. And it was really a very heady place. It was brought about, like many of the progressive schools, at the post-industrial revolution, when a lot of this idea of moving away from Station 1, Station 2, Station 3, and you get a Model T at the end of it. That's pretty much the way education, and people were sort of pushing against that sort of authoritarian and sequential way of thinking about education. So I went to this school that had mixed ages, fully integrated curriculum, and we'll come back to these things. And my father had gone there, his brother had gone there, my brothers had gone there, all my cousins had gone there. And so it was sort of a very early time in my life to think a little bit about how we look at the world. Some early discussions about social justice, equity issues. I'm not even sure we referred to them that way at the time. It was also an interesting place where it tried to do some interesting things. It brought kids from Mattapan and Roxbury in an attempt to increase racial diversity. That's something I remember. And in about 2 or 3 years, the numbers declined. The school hadn't really thought about the culture it was, as progressive as it was, how friendly it was to people who didn't come from, at that time, the macro culture. And I always thought about that a little bit. And then I went on to public high school, which was pretty traditional public high school, though I had wonderful teachers, and then college, and then business for a year, and then I went to Lesley University, which at the time was Lesley College, and I had gone back to Shady Hill, which had a teacher training program, and you sort of do your student teaching there, and then Milton Academy, which I would not call progressive, although they did some very cool things, and then became involved in the Interim school, which was probably the beginning of thinking about what it meant as an adult to engage in the best principles of progressive ed, and that launched a number of things, including a relationship with Project Zero at Harvard, folks, Howard Gardner, David Perkins, you may have heard of, and thinking about my practice as a teacher, I became head of the Interim school, and then went on to run a number of schools, some that were profoundly clear they were progressive based on a guy named John Dewey's work at the turn of the last century, and some that would be defined more by the question of who do we serve, and that's an interesting tension. But that was most recently Vernon School up on Mulholland and 405, and that was 11 years, and then I've been absolutely thrilled and excited to be here for 2 years. And in a lot of ways, it's coming home. This is it's very similar to the Interim school with a high school. Interim was a K through 6, so it didn't have the middle and high school years, which has been interesting to think about a K through 12 continuum. So that's what brought me here, and sort of we'll get into a couple other things as we go. But I thought if you wanted to. You want to tell me a little bit about yourself?
So I grew up in a town called Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And I don't know how familiar you are with Pennsylvania's geography, but if you, on the east-west axis of the state, if you put yourself right in the middle and go the whole way down to the Mason-Dixon line, that's essentially where I grew up. We call that, it's the edge of Appalachia. It's really not Appalachia, but I was from a small town. I'm actually the first in my family to go to college. So I went to the public schools in Chambersburg, which, fortunately were pretty good. I mean, certainly as rural schools in Pennsylvania go. They were large. I had 685 people in my graduating class. So, big school. Along the way, I had very, very compelling Latin teachers in this school system. And exposure to them and exposure to this really difficult, interesting language, which really felt more like a puzzle than a language to a high school student, I decided I wanted to be a Latin teacher. So I went to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster and majored in Latin, and along the way picked up Greek. So I spent 4 years studying Latin and ancient Greek, ancient literature. I did some anthropology and some other things. Spent my junior year at University College London, which is one of the constituent colleges of the University of London, where I also studied Sanskrit for a year. I will never teach Sanskrit. Do not become excited about this. It was extraordinarily difficult. Glad I did it. I was glad I had 1 year and that was enough. And then went to Brown for a PhD because I decided along the way maybe I wanted to do research as well at that time. So Brown had a PhD program in classics, has one, it's very good. And so while I was there in Providence, one of the things Brown does is place graduate students, in addition to having teaching assistantships and teaching fellowships in the academic departments, works with some of the schools in the east side of Providence. And one of those is a place called Lincoln School. Lincoln is a Quaker day school, K through 12, pre-K through 12 actually. At the time it had 330 students, all girls. So they needed a middle school Latin teacher, part-time. So I taught middle school Latin in Providence at a Quaker girls' school. And I went in thinking, foolishly, and with no preparation whatsoever. I figured, well, it's kind of like graduate school, just slower. It is not. And I would say, I was having a conversation with somebody who turns out to be very important to me here yesterday, and as I said to her, that time really taught me that I teach people. I teach young people, not just the subject, which could be an overlooked facet of graduate school teaching. So I loved that experience for 2 years. A series of almost a coincidences. I ended up back at Franklin and Marshall as a classics professor. I did that for 8 years and then became a staff member and an administrator. So I did some fundraising while I was there and ended up as a vice president and had worked under 2 presidents there. At that point, I started to wonder what I wanted to do next, and somebody said to me, you should consider independent school headships. And I said, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, because I went to public schools, I did have that experience at Lincoln, but really that's about it. And I had a very persuasive dean of students, who's now, by the way, the head of Greenwich Academy in Connecticut, so she kept sort of pushing on this idea. And so I started to take it seriously, and I ended up as the head of George School, just to kind of cut to that. George School is a Quaker boarding and day school. It's about 50-50 boarding and day with 540 students, 9th through 12th grade. It is a place where students, when I was there, came from 47 countries and 19 states. And taking the international students out of the picture, there were about 18%. There's really no one ethnic group that was a majority. I mean, there were pluralities at different times and different years, but it was an interesting, very diverse place. And progressive in its social sort of handling of students, the great emphasis on the whole child. It also had a lot of APs and in the IB diploma program. So it was progressive up to a point, progressive light, I would say. Happy to talk more about that. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more later in my experiences with that. This person who was very important to me, a woman named Donzalea Abernathy. I told the alums that I would be stepping down, I was going to take a year off, I had a sabbatical that was being paid out. Donzalea came up to me afterwards and she said, you have to check out this place called New Roads School. New Roads is a place that is intentional about its commitment to diversity, the diversity of Los Angeles. It is committed to advancing, to providing opportunities for our students. It's deeply progressive, social justice oriented, and I helped found it. So Donzalea is somebody, if you know her, she is very smart. She's very persuasive and passionate. So she remembers that we had this conversation for quite a long time. I actually don't remember that. She described it as a village as well. And I said, well, I'm taking this year. And then when I was looking for jobs again, this headship was there. And I thought, well, one takes Donzalea seriously. And I read about the school. I found its commitment to diversity compelling, to say the least. The description of the school in the website suggested that it is really a village. It's warm. It is a place. It's almost an idea. It's a mission. It's not simply a campus or simply a credentialing place, but it's a school that cares about the quality of its graduates. And it sounded a lot like a Quaker school, bringing out the best of each individual and not forcing conformity. So I applied, and let me tell you, that was a rigorous process. You do not need to worry that anybody was not careful. They were very. And
not so much for the interim.
Well, they did a very good job, actually. But in any case, I got the job, and I'm in Los Angeles because of New Roads, and honored to be here, and thrilled to be here. And I will say everything that I've experienced about the school during this transition makes me love it and love this village even more.
Can we kick the next slide up? Is the quote up there? Yeah. So this quote always stuck with me, and I think sort of helped define thinking about progressive ed. I'm going to be entirely candid as I look back on my career. I worry about progressive ed and its sustaining force. I don't think ever needed more in terms of some philosophical issues and some practice. But we're seeing things get chipped away, little by little. Progressive ed 40 years ago, 45 years ago, we knew that, back to my post-industrial revolution thing, that grade levels, that summer vacation didn't delineate child development, right? That we had that same model, right? K, 1, 2, 3, all the way through 12, then you get a Model T or a graduate. But there was a lot of experimenting. Much of it in the early, in the 20s and the 30s. There was in public schools. It was they used to call them normal schools, and if you study them, the idea was they were trying to take these ideas of Dewey sort of Colonel. Well, he was a colonel, but Francis Parker. You may have heard of those schools. There's one in San Diego, and there's one in Chicago. And these schools were, at the time, experimental. The idea being that couple components. Some we are all aware of, and again, Paul Cummins and again, the Crossroads founding and coming to New Roads, and actually then Tree Academy. There's a trajectory there that probably don't have time to talk about. It'd be fun to hear Paul's thoughts about that. He was a very active leader in the Progressive Ed Network, even when I was starting out. But the nature of things that were being not just experimented with, but actually proven to be valid. Francis Parker had this idea. He was a colonel. It was an interesting juxtaposition. He was in the military and then came back, and was really one of the forward-thinking leaders around peace and justice, the integrated day, and a number of things that have struggled in the contemporary culture. We can talk about that and how those things got chipped away. But the idea, my teaching career started in 3rd grade, but I joined a school where I taught 3rd, 4th, and 5th, a mixed age group. And we didn't call them you're in the 3, 4, 5s. We would call them the explorers. You know, we'd have grandparents' day, and the kids would look at their grandparents and say, you know, I'm an explorer. And, you know, the grandpa, what grade are you in? Well, I don't know. I'm an explorer. And, you know, I'm here for 3 years. But there were some very cool things about that, right? Your most able 3rd grader in mathematics, I'm going to use traditional grade levels to describe this, and somebody who's just coming to numeracy at a different rate in 5th grade, they could be together for that, and then maybe in language arts, it flipped. And somebody who's incredibly strong in literacy in the younger elements or in the older elements would sort of encourage somebody in the younger grades to continue to further their own literacy skills. So, but a number of things happened over the last 40 or 50 years. Standardized testing, back to basics, a number of moves, and to think that we can divide our educational systems from a political system is a little complicated. And I think politicians are pretty strong in the back to basics and test scores, and innovative educators are, if we do this right, in progressive education, if we really do this right, we are building horizontal and vertical learners. And really the last thing they're going to have to, that a standardized test would be a slight hurdle that they have to get over. But if you're really doing the right thing for students, and you all probably, you know, you've seen outgrowths of this, again, over 100 years ago, Montessori, the Steiner schools that became the Waldorf schools. There's been a lot of experimentations with really thoughtful people trying out how to hold on to some of these great components of progressive ed and buffeted by winds that I fully get of, you know, anxious folks wondering how does this play out if I want my child to continue on these complex journeys that are often being narrowed by institutions that set expectations. We don't really build a Piagetian bottom-up model. We make high school look a little like college, and we make middle school look a little like high school and elementary. That was never the idea, right? The idea was kids come in knowing stuff, and little by little we build on that. And it's created, I think, a natural tension. And I think the beauty of my 2 years here is to see a school that's willing to keep arguing about ultimately what we know is right for kids, what we know a true participation in democracy might look like, and the kind of citizens we want engaging that. Doesn't mean we all agree, but that we are trying to create a climate for discourse to only make our society, I think, better in every way. And of course, there's other things. We was talking to folks about AI, and we'll come up with that in some of the questions here. But we never are lacking for new ways to confound childhood. And I think New Roads, and no school's perfect, is an antidote to some of that, and it should continue to lean in that direction. And I think as we celebrate our 30th year, to understand where we are and where we might go, we have to understand who we were at the beginning and what sort of yielded this wonderful organization. So, any comments?
Not really. I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is really just to emphasize that for the good of society right now, We need more students like the ones who graduated a couple of weeks ago. Which is to say, those who are committed to what I'll call the arts of democracy, democratic society, and who are really, really smart and well-educated, because I think that commitment is critical. I also think the quality of the education, the ability to argue, the ability to listen, and to have high standards for that democratic participation is only going to be more important. And wherever possible, lack cynicism, which is really hard to do.
Yeah. Optimism is a short supply these days, but it's a good place to be optimistic. So we put a question, so you submitted questions. There were a bunch of them. We'll go through them. I put the hardest ones behind here. I don't think we'll get to them. Come on, folks, work with me. That's a joke. We'll get started, and we'll go through pretty quickly. And then if we want to do some back and forth, and if I'm in any way stepped in it or whatever, you want to challenge some assumptions here. Of course, this is a good place to do it. I'm going to now read this question. In an era of increasing polarization, how can progressive schools ensure that students encounter a broad range of credible perspectives and develop the skills to evaluate sources and challenge misinformation? Take it away, Sam.
Honestly, when I read through the distillation, this is a distillation of several questions, the word that really stood out to me, and the hardest one, actually, to address is the word credible. Because I think all of us, and students, surely, meet all kinds of ideas and declarations and assertions about themselves and about the world around them and what is good or bad. And many of those, particularly if you're in the world of social media, are devoid of any kind of a defense or an argument. They're just statements and declarations. So I think one of the things a school like New Roads needs to do is help students sift out what might be credible that they disagree with or agree with or don't know. On the one hand, from things that really aren't credible. And then to figure out what to do with both. Because I do think it's a mistake to say, well, that's not credible, we won't pay attention to it. Because I think that can be incredibly dangerous. But I think over time, students, as they're introduced to a variety of perspectives, which I happen to find very important, are able to critique them, to argue, to defend what they think, to listen to their peers, listening to completion, and grapple. And you can start that in elementary school and go the whole way through high school in an increasingly sophisticated way, age-appropriate way. But students not being able to distinguish what's credible or not, I think, is one issue, and then what to do with that is another. There was a question that came up yesterday actually when Donzale and I talked. What should students have when they graduate? And when I think about that, I think a capacity for discernment. And by that I mean students need to know a sufficient amount by the time they graduate, and certainly learn along the way, about who they are. Who am I as a person? And what is it that I want to accomplish? What are my values? What are the things I'm still trying to figure out? And then with that, when I'm exposed to all of these other ideas, when I'm to assertions, declarations, images, whatever it is, what of those am I going to observe and know that they're there and not ignore them? Which of those am I going to take seriously as things I may not agree with, but I want to hear more and try to learn about other people's perspectives? And what are the things that I'm really going to get down and wrestle with? And what am I going to, I want to sit down and have a conversation with my classmates. I want to talk with my teacher. And we're going to figure out how to sort of understand those things and take them apart and see if they might be transformational for me or might reinforce what I think about my own values. But I think that there are two parts to discernment. One is really, really good critical thinking, and then the other is knowing who you are to begin with. Because I think one of the things that worries me, and there are a lot of things, everybody will hear about things that worry me while I'm here. But one of the things that really does worry me about young people is they're just exposed to so much, and you can't control it all. I mean, we can't control it all. And they need to have a place to bring that into the classroom if it's happening outside, and sit down and talk with us about what it is they're discerning, what, or what they're being exposed to, and what they can do about it. And I'll say, turn this over to Dan in a minute. I started at George School in 2016. That was an election year. And it was in a Quaker school. And we had a small group of students who wanted to have a Republican club. And no teacher would advise them. Which, in a Quaker school may or may not be surprising. I was sort of upset about that, but nobody wanted to do it. So I did. And also co-sponsored the LGBTQ student group, which confused everyone. But in terms of 2016, it really did confuse everyone. But I wanted those students to have a place where they could sit down, work through ideas, arguments, and it turned out they were actually, and they thought they were pretty conservative. They actually kind of weren't. But they're students, they're young. But telling them they're not allowed to talk, or telling them they don't have sanction to explore ideas, I think would have been the wrong lesson. And I wouldn't want that to happen to the LGBTQ students any more than I would want it to happen to those students. And if something irresponsible had been going on, somebody should be there to try to help them. It didn't. We had parents who would take them to political rallies and things. I didn't have to do that. But they needed, by the school's rules, a faculty or staff member to be their sponsor and to be there for their meetings. And I wanted to make sure they had that space. Frankly, I'm glad I did it. I learned a lot about them. And some of them, I'm still in touch with some of them, actually.
That's great. And I'll focus on the word polarization. We're all aware of it, right? As any distance between two parties gets wider and wider, the only way to be heard is to start yelling. And I do worry about that. And I think there is no better place to practice than what John Wooden say. You can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that there's no better place to practice those democratic values in schools. And it can start in early childhood. And those lessons can build over time. And they really start in many ways. You talk about discernment, this search for the truth and what is truth. And I think that I've written to many of you, the kitchen table often is the first classroom, and how do those sort of mesh as we think about working together. I do think as long as voices aren't aggressively doing harm, multiple perspectives are the best shot at practicing in a third grade morning meeting or a fifth grade classroom, or all the way through high school as both the kids and the stakes grow higher. I never thought during my lifetime that that the people of eminent leadership, those that we hold in huge high regard, or maybe should just in a democratic society, now have great talk. We will now have the fact checker, that this idea of discernment and truth, and it seems we're having more and more of a casual relationship with truth than I remember us having. I think it is a complicated thing to teach in a progressive school. It's much harder to teach in a progressive school for lots of different reasons, but I think that idea of teachers remaining, and I'm not making a categorical statement about our faculty, I'm talking about sort of progressive education in general. You have to be kind of wicked nimble. You have to, as a teacher in a progressive school, and you have to be able to sort of, and much of this came from the progressive. Everything you heard these days about, not sage on the stage versus guide on the side, these were written about in the 30s. The idea that community, all of us being smarter than one of us, these are ideas that really grew out of the work of the early progressive education movement and have relevance to this idea of that education is democracy. It is preparation for life. It is also life at the same time. So I concur with everything that you said. It's the polarization and the fact that it takes shape in a way that I think is actually counter to intellectually keeping multiple ideas in your head at the same time.
I'm glad you mentioned community, and I'll mention two aspects of Friends education. One is that discernment happens in community. So, you alone could easily mislead yourself, is what the Quakers thought. So you want to be in a classroom or in a community, a school community, to work through issues, questions, things that come up, that helps your ability to discern. It's how you grow. And the second that I think we can't lose sight of, and I feel this is very strongly at New Roads, Quakers will say there's that of God in everyone. And what they really, I think, mean is the individual expressions of humanity in each of us are our shared humanity expressed differently. And it's really important in a community, in an educational community, to help students understand that by virtue of being human, we share more than we don't. And that has to happen with more and more noise, than I think has happened in the past. I think there's going to be a separate question about polarization. I feel like we're venturing into that. But it was really striking to me to be in two Friends schools, and they both embraced wholeheartedly that you are you will grow up to be you have gifts, you will take them out into the world, and you share humanity with every single person in the school, whether you agree with them today or not. And the way to discover that is not to yell at each other.
Yeah, I was smiling a little bit. I interviewed at a Friends school in Philadelphia many years ago, and it was one of the schools that was run by two Friends meetings. Many have one Friends meeting, then reform them. And I remember, talking because everything Sam said was sort of embedded in Friends philosophy. He said, well, how's it going with two different meetings running one school? And they go, well, the two meetings don't get along well. I go, well, they're not really listening to themselves, are they, in their philosophy? So let's try a new one here. Is that, how can progressive schools foster discourse across disagreement? So some similar thoughts, and some of these may sort of trip into similar answers, but first I think naming the disagreement. Sometimes we need clarity in what the disagreement is.
Very true.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's one thing I've said of worth right here. But I think people, I use the term, sometimes we rush to cheap closure. Cheap closure is a term that sort of resonated with me, that you stop listening and you're already answering, or that sort of thing. So just really kind of naming, taking time, taking a beat, and slowing down. What are we really disagreeing about? And then, I think schools and progressive schools particularly, some of it's structural, right? If you think about, let's be, mundane, but a desk in rows, you're looking at the back of somebody, and the teacher's up front, and let's have a debate and discussion about that. It doesn't lend itself. This is somewhat of a presentation and discussion, but I think that most of you know me, and I know some of this comes from Quaker meetings too, that I'd always rather be in a circle. I'd always rather us be in a circle, depending on size and looking at one another if we're really going to talk about disagreement. So, have we really named it? Have we not rushed to cheap closure? Have we sort of leaned into the power of listening, particularly now more than ever? It's almost like now we have, you make a good point, but let me give you a counterpoint. Let me check my phone first, and then I'll give you the counterpoint. Versus really living in the intellectual climate that you said, am I really hearing what you're saying? Let me give it back to you, and let me make sure I understand it. And then I think those are skills, those are muscles that can be built over time, and schools have a responsibility to build those muscles. We already see plenty of models of the cheap closure philosophy out there. This is heady, intellectual, emotional work, and connecting one's mind with one's heart, with one's passions, with one's history is incredibly essential when you're thinking about really naming the disagreement and then beginning to tackle it. And I think those are things that schools can do more of. And again, I think if it's done well, it only makes us a brighter group of people. It just makes us smarter if we're not shutting someone down, or if we're not rushing to think about how to nullify somebody's perspective. you know, the more voices, the more civil but thoughtful voices can only increase, I think, the intellectual climate of any organization, but particularly a school.
Right. I don't have too much to add to that. I would say that one of the questions I found helpful to ask older students sometimes, depending on the nature of the disagreement, is, you know, what do you agree about? Or what do you want? You know, what is it you're trying to achieve? And often if you keep asking, you know, and then what, they discover that there's something underneath that they both want. And they're going about it and looking at it in different ways, and that's leading to, you know, an emotional disagreement sometimes. So I found that helpful as well. And I'm afraid you've nailed it as far as I'm concerned on this. I mean, I think we have to keep coming back to it and not being afraid to have conversations. And, you know, yelling is not, you know, I'm using yelling, but, you know, being confrontational and sort of seeing disagreement as a zero-sum competition is not actually good for anyone. It's certainly not good for society. And I don't want students from New Roads graduating thinking zero-sum competition is the way the world needs to work. And their world doesn't have to work that way. There's room for 2 perspectives, or 3 perspectives, or 10 perspectives. And that's fine. You know, that doesn't threaten you.
I'm just reveling in the fact that a college professor thought I had a good thing to say. Not been my experience. So let's go to the next one. Okay. Oh, yeah. How does New Roads plan to build the Socratic habits, discernment, and aesthetic independence students need to interrogate AI rather than be directed by it? Next one.
I'll start with my joke, actually, on this one. And then, actually, I think this is more a question about AI than it is some of the other aspects of it. But, you know, I have a friend who went to law school. They were taught by the Socratic method, or so they claimed. And she said, you know, if you've ever read a Platonic dialogue where Socrates and an interlocutor are having a conversation, Socrates talks all the time and the other person says yes or no. You know, that's all they say. So, you know, that is not actually terribly Socratic in the way we like to think of it. You know, I think, you know, this is something that I'll say it worries me. I don't think I have a pat answer for it. But, you know, AI is of great value, and I think AI is many things, number one, and it's the sort of tool or the set of tools that can help free us on the one hand, or, you know, enslave us on the other. AI can help plan a trip to California. Actually, I went there with my itinerary and where I could stay with an 80-pound dog, but I didn't just assume what I got out of it was true. I mean, I went back and checked it all and made some changes that were right for me. There are more and more examples of fields that are being either supported by or replaced by AI. I think one of the things I'll just say that AI cannot do is have emotional intelligence. At least it might imitate it, but it really can't. And it can't really sort of acknowledge the differences in each of the users, if you will. You know, and where I think a school like New Roads can really excel is to teach, you know, to keep in AI purely for a second, teach students how to be, you know, critical thinkers, thorough analysts, so that they can use this tool really effectively. It does not replace humanity. And it can, and it won't, I don't think. I think, you know, for all that we're worried about it, I think it's on us to make sure it doesn't. But for us, doing simple things like, and, you know, it wasn't simple, I'm sure, when it happened, but having students present during the day instead of on their phones between classes. You know, they get a chance to know their classmates. They get a chance to talk. And as I understand it, one of the big concerns about students having tech with them all the time was that the passing time was wasted, and there were fewer opportunities that students took to talk with one another about the class they just had, or to meet people who may be new to the school. And, you know, I think that it's going to be more incumbent on us than it has been before to shepherd and guide that. with the students and teach them how to do that. So it really becomes, there's going to be some of that outside the classroom. And I think our teachers really need to model these things and help students develop those capacities on their own so that they can think for themselves. I'm not I'm an AI light skeptic, but I'm not somebody who thinks we should not touch it. Because I think there are ethical uses for it, and there are effective uses, and there are unethical and ineffective. And the students will indeed figure out how to use it, whether we want them to or not. And I would rather they have some guidance and guidelines that's involved doing that, rather than ignore it.
That's well said. And I also, there are people in the audience who are far more expert in the field of AI. I was watching the tube last night because of the basketball game, but there was this news. The head of Anthropic came on. And I don't know if you saw this, but he said, I think the federal government's got to get involved. And you had that look on his face like, this thing's getting away from us. I grew up in a time where, the Terminator, I figured the world's coming to an end. So I'm not quite as optimistic. It's a good time for you to get out of any education. But I am old enough to remember Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. And I was a chess player as a kid, and they were kind of heroic figures. Both of them kind of wacky. I'll give you that. But I was, they brilliant practitioners of the sport. And I don't know if you remember or you were around the Big Blue, that IBM came up with a computer that was going to, I think, play Spassky. I can't if I remember, my memory's right. And I remember just thinking, well, this is half the fun, right? Just this is the mechanics of that. I'm not trying to make a big metaphorical leap into AI, but I do think that schools have always been places during my career that where technology, the first Apple IIe and the one computer classroom. In progressive schools, it's always been this interesting challenge around screens because if you think again about the early progressive movement, it was kids' relationship with nature that was a huge, huge denominator for progressive schools. You read Jack London's Call of the Wild, but you would get in blankets and sit in the snow so you could identify with freezing to death. And I think that there were certain practices that had to do with living outdoors. And you probably all read books these days about nature deficiencies in kids and those sorts of things. So I'm very happy that as a school we sort of moved away from direct access, but we have kids on the screen. I don't know what Dewey and Parker would make of this Montessori of life in 2 dimensions and life on screens. It's an interesting question because there hasn't been a lot of evidence that technology, there's been some evidence that technology has been supportive and causal to some learning. It's not clear how much evidence there is that technology is causal, and I would put AI in this category, to wisdom. And I think that is something we have to think about because really what the early progressives were all about was this idea of this relationship of wisdom and knowledge and decency and character and those sorts of things. And so I am, being obviously a little facetious at the beginning, I'm fascinated by AI, any number of contemporary uses, and probably it may be my own ignorance that feeds my anxiety, but I think it's worthy of paying attention. I think schools need to pay attention to this. I think parents need to partner with schools, and we collectively need to pay attention to it because there is I'm sure there's an argument, and a healthy argument, for its role within contemporary progressive education. I just am not sure we've clearly defined it yet, and it's happening so fast that just when you think you've got it figured out, there's a new mousetrap that is even more complex to, in some ways, it creates something kind of hot and interesting and even more complex, and it sort of feeds on itself. And all of us want an education because of some deep need to control our environment. And so any respectable head of school or any respectable progressive educator looks with interest and skepticism in equal measure, I think, as we think about this.
Yeah, probably in most things, actually, if we're being honest. I think philosophy departments in some colleges and universities are growing as AI is growing as well. And I think the sort of the utilitarian argument is that, you can learn to program, AI or to develop AI if you have a good philosophical education. I don't know that that's true. I don't endorse it, but that is an interesting thing I've been exposed to now a few times. George School had a media studies course, actually a couple of courses, where we taught students to critique, essentially then it was social media, and to do storytelling. And so they, in that course, while I was there, were teaching about the immigration crisis, and the immigration crisis coming from the Middle East, Syria specifically. And, the students read various media accounts, and, you see plenty of writing about immigration, and some of it is pretty hostile, and some of it is pretty optimistic, and it was true then. It was generally European media they were looking at. But then they traveled to Greece and actually worked with immigrants and did a storytelling unit, and then came back and were able to sort of compare their experiences and what they gathered with what they were reading in the press, and to make up their own mind. And so it was an experiential course, but it was something that actually gave them a chance to think critically about what they were encountering. There may well be something like that about AI that we could be doing too.
Thanks. We have a couple more, and here I am talking about progressive ed and its interactive nature, and then we're just yakking at it. So I'd love to turn this a bit into discussion for the last few minutes, but let's do one or two more. And if we miss a theme, or you submitted something, or you're curious about something, we can just call from if that sounds okay. So we'll do a couple more here. It comes back to the concept of community. Accommodating, if I have it right, how to navigate the tension between accommodating the individual and honoring the community. That's great. That's a good one.
Let me try, and then there's a part of me that wants, every individual to be able to do pretty much whatever they want to, and that doesn't work. I think communities, even progressive schools, progressive communities, need to have standards for behavior, for how they do things, and those need to be clear. They need to be clear to the students. They need to be clear to families, to guardians. They need to be clear to the faculty and staff as well. So to give an obvious example, if you are expressing your individuality by hitting another student, that's not an okay expression of your individuality. And not only does it harm another individual, but it harms the whole community when there's violence, or when there are threats, when there's bullying, when there's ostracizing. And these are things kids do. The very best kids can fall into this. So there has to be a set of standards. And then within that, giving individuals a chance to express themselves, I think, becomes much more realistic and much more interesting. But, as much as it's kind of fun for me to imagine and promising for me to imagine letting 1,000 flowers bloom, there really have to be community standards for any community to work. And so, that can be expressed in very positive, proactive, helping students understand how to be together in, say, a middle school, and how to conduct themselves toward one another, and knowing that there are people around who care, and they're going to, intervene and help you meet those standards if you're having trouble with it. And then there are times too when something goes wrong, and I know there have been some questions about discipline that came up, and I don't know if they're exactly distilled into this or not, but to me it touches on this. There are times, for example, when a suspension is warranted, not to single out and punish a student so much as to give a student a chance to think about what they did, and the community a chance to recover. And a productive way to use, say, a suspension is to write a reflective piece, write a note to the student you might have harmed, and then and that's where intentional bad behavior. But then there are other times when students are unintentionally doing things to one another, and I think that's really where we as educators need to intervene and say, no, that's not how that. This is how what you're saying is being received. And ideally, we've already been doing some education in that area so that we can point and say, oh yeah, we did talk about that, instead of, this is news for the first time. And, there will always be a reactive element to that process, but to the extent we can be proactive in this, I think it's really, really important to do. It doesn't need to be oppressive, but I think we need to be really honest and really clear about our standards and how our discipline system works, and to be consistent developmentally across the divisions of the school.
Yeah, and I think that, just to add that there are some, in practice, Northeast Foundation for Children, they founded a responsive classroom. There's a lot of thinking, there's a great book, The First 6 Weeks of School, where a lot of educators just spend the first 6 weeks getting those norms and values down. It's harder to teach in a progressive school. I just want to come back to that. A progressive classroom is active, it's busy, it's interactive, it is not, it's child-centered. And that was one of the early books, I think in the 20s or 30s, that child-centered school was written. Harold Coons, I think, wrote it. There's another, somebody wrote it with him, but it was really the early days of thinking about how you build that interactive classroom. To build that kind of classroom, you are in your classroom long after the students are gone, because the classroom has to become the environment. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work unless those norms and values are really incredibly well understood. Because one of the big, no-nos in all of education, but I think progressive education, is interrupting somebody else's learning. And that can be behavioral, it can be a flaw in the structure. And by the way, when I say this, and I say this with love for this, no school I've seen has it absolutely perfectly figured out. But if we're going to drop our anchor in the progressive harbor, I think we do need to figure that out and continue to figure it out. And we're a work in progress after 30 years. But I love what Sam said, and this idea of we can't begin to think about the individual needs unless as a community we're clear on what we're all about. And I think that was, again, I'm informed by the early practice as a progressive educator, but Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, Kendi, so many people have added to the sort of lexicon of what really works in progressive education that's led to places like Project Zero, EDC, Turk, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm a little biased, but the D School at Stanford. A lot of people are really trying to kind of hold on, if not indeed incorporate some of these philosophies that sort of say, to really elevate the individual, we have to be clear as a community on sort of where the boundaries and structures are.
And I'll just add to all of that, when something goes wrong, when that doesn't mean a student should be stigmatized for their entire school career. There are some egregious things, but the majority of the time, the students who are at odds with one another, if we're doing our job well, should have an opportunity, after a little bit, maybe a little separation, if that's what's required, to be able to sit down with one another, or for a student to sit down with members of the community and work through what happened and see if there's a way for that student to be integrated into the community. Because I also think that's really important. We all make mistakes, and kids are more prone to them, I think, than adults. Although probably I could probably find counter examples. But what I wouldn't then want is for a student to carry a kind of stigma forever because of something they did in 6th grade. That would be a shame. And
yeah, and I think that's what restorative. We forget you only do. So there may be there's a great article in Education. It was April about restorative justice doesn't mean, and I don't know, restorative justice or when the criminal justice system worked its way into the juvenile system and then worked its way through school systems. And it's the idea of, instead of sole punitive, how are you really repairing and restoring and restructuring relationships? And the wonderful author who has had implemented this in a number of settings said it's not consequence-free, but it doesn't end at the consequence. And I think that is an important thing that we all can continue and should continue to work on. We'll do one more, and how to progressive education support gifted learners. That's a great question. And I was not trained in gifted education, and when I went to Merman, It showed. But I do think that was a rather unique experience. And interesting enough, a number of progressive schools, you may know these names, right? I'm talking independent schools, although there's some great models in public and even in parochial and Jewish day schools. There were great progressive practices, even if in our stereotype head we think about more of a narrow systemic form of pedagogy. But so I think Dalton, these schools you may remember, Francis Parker in Chicago. What happens is they get popular. The U Chicago Lab School is inundated with applications. It's John Dewey's school. It's Francis Parker's school. If you look at the progressive, many of them began their work in Chicago and Columbia Teachers College were probably two of the big sort of think tanky, practical, educational, experiential opportunities. What I've seen is this trajectory is it gets popular, and then suddenly you go from maybe an application per spot or 2 applications per spot to 15 applications per spot to 30 applications per spot. In New York, you need to sign your child up for preschool long before 7th grade, and the idea that you're seeing an engineering, if you will, of classrooms in a way that I'm not sure the early progressives ever really, they were much more about the norm. They called them normal schools for a reason. So I think a great progressive school is, I'll come back to this word, nimble as heck. They just are nimble. Everybody doing the same thing at the same time. There may be a place for that. And there may be a shared experience. And progressive Dewey's reflexive cycle said, you have a shared experience, right? You have a theory and a shared experience. You test it out. You come back and review, and then you modify, and then you've advanced it. And that cycle keeps going until ideally destinations are achieved. And that works, believe it or not, for a wide range of learners, including kids in gifted education. If you actually really look at the fundamental philosophies around some special ed philosophies related to education and gifted education, I know it because I did this little experiment, the language is very similar. The language is actually very similar. It does follow this reflective cycle. And the problem now is that you get online and you hear like, Houghton Mifflin has got this new idea. What we do, you can buy our text and it's a reflective cycle. I'm like, you did not make that up. It's been around forever. But like anything, it goes through a variety of different innovations. I also think that you have to be willing to differentiate in the classroom in an incredibly sophisticated way. I'll come back to that. It is so hard to reach everyone in the classroom. I can say this as a practitioner. It is just hard. The only way to do that is to be flexible. There's a guy named Vygotsky, and he basically had a theory of proximal development, where at certain developmental times you're ready to take in this concept. Some are bored, some aren't ready. And great teachers kind of live in this zone. They kind of understand where every child is in this zone. It was translated to me in my early days as what that really means, Dan, is there's 20 kids and you deliver a lesson and 3 understand it, 5 are asleep, and 8 are already off to the restroom. And it was more of a baseline view of Vygotsky but it spoke to the reality that, and we all went to school, maybe many of us went to these schools where, here's the lesson, and 10% or 15% might be bored, and 10 or 15% may have no idea what's going on, and a teacher walks away going, it's a pretty good lesson. You have to teach and assess at the same time. In progressive education, you are teaching and assessing at the same time, right? And the nature of assessment is so complex, right? That's why coaching is such a beautiful form of teaching, because you spend that week and you're teaching these lessons and you're working together. The assessment's on the field, right? It's different than teaching. Hey, here's how you figure out this algorithm. Okay, good. You got to be. That's a different form of teaching than coaching, and it's a merging of those two that the progressive really felt had to do with the relational nature of teaching. You have to know your students, you have to know them, not just their intellect, but you have to know who they are. And I'm a little passionate about this one, but I think there is a place, a strong place, for schools addressing gifted learners, but it is, not to take a page out of our t-shirt, one size does not fit all, and that includes pedagogical thinking as well.
Yeah, and I would just say, where I came from, George School, we never used the term gifted, which is sort of interesting. It was a high school. Come back to what we did do, but I would say the differentiation is what I would say as well. I think it looks different for different students sometimes, and it depends on how being gifted expresses itself sometimes. That can be, a very conventionally academically oriented kid. It could be a kid who's incredibly creative, a highly unconventional thinker. And so I think it's on us as a school to try to meet their needs where they are, and that's the differentiation part. And when they get into upper school, then we're talking about, are there research opportunities for them, or the think creative opportunities that might be, connected to Los Angeles, for example. I mean, we are in a place that has almost limitless cultural resources, and I would like to use those for all of our students, but that would include the gifted students. The experience I had at George School very quickly was that we had students taking APs from 9th through 12th grade. So we had a group of them. We had a group of students who were doing the IB diploma program. About a quarter to a third of each graduating class did that. That was 11th and 12th grade. And we had some who kind of zigzagged through all of that, and we had some who did none of it. That became a de facto tracking experience. So you really looked. You could see tracks, and the school used to track before I was there. It used to track students, and they stopped doing that, but they were still kind of doing it. That's really not that's not the type of differentiation that I would like to see. I think, being kind of separated from your peers is probably not the best thing to do for anyone, and including gifted students and the other students.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. If you're teaching a BC Cal class, the assumption is everybody's in the stratosphere. You got to differentiate like heck. Even if you have 10 kids in a BC Cal class, they all need something else. Maybe it's emotional, maybe it's a different thing on their intellectual growth. But teaching can't be passive. And what I love about this school, it's willing to at least have those discussions. And how does that play out? The other thing is we close and we'll open up, that maybe some of the slides would have gotten us there. There is an active nature of learning, teaching in a progressive school. And I think New Roads really is kind of a magical place for that, and a great incubator. The progressives were about social justice. John Dewey, founding member of NAACP, maybe 15 years later, founder of the ACLU. There was always a strong social justice drive in the progressive movement. I worried, over the years that schools sort of said, we embrace diversity. We embrace authentic diversity, and I'm not taking any shots at this language. But the thing I remember loving about true progressive thought is the nature of activism and the power of activism. And man, is it needed more now than anything. And it's tricky in schools, don't get me wrong. But it's sort of like not enough to say, we absolutely take race incredibly seriously. We're welcoming, we're supportive. That is different than being anti-racist. Mm-hmm. All right? We are LGBTQ, we want kids to feel belong, we want families. That's different than being, purposely and activist-based anti-homophobic, right? One, I think the progressives got right. We want to look at these issues. What we still want to wrestle with as a school, we want to teach our kids, not activism just for activism's sake, but where is this element of righteousness and justice, and how does that play out from the earliest days in the elementary school? I mean, kids are so much better at this, right? Young kids, it just comes out very clearly. That's not fair, right? And what does that look like as children get older? And frankly, what's it look like as we get older? what does activism look like? What does it mean to be not necessarily in just language and affect, appear to be welcoming and appear to be supportive, but willing to take on and interrupt injustice. Now that's a heavy-duty thing for a third grader, but progressives believe, like Vygotsky believes, there's zones of proximal development of when that can happen. And I'll tell you, I don't think even after schooling, traditional schooling, it's ever too late to be an activist. And I do love that nature of this school and its willingness to have hard conversations. The conversations can only be deeper if we're willing to listen to each other and really demonstrate some of these principles that were really founded well over 100 years ago. And I think we're still looking for this sweet spot, which is probably ever changing.
Right. Well, thank you. I think I had an experience when I was applying right out of graduate school for jobs. One of them was a joint sort of appointment, kind of odd but interesting, at a liberal arts college and at an adjacent school in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, by the way, is not on my resume. I got to the finalist round, and I was meeting with the head of the school, not the college, but the school. And the head said, the last word in the school name is, it's academy. You know what that means. It's a segregation academy. And I said, yes. And he said, but our trustees, however many years ago, had the good sense to integrate the school. Okay. And he said, we now have 12 black students, and we think our black students are comfortable. This was a white man. And, even at, coming from Brown, but I'm like, that's a lunch table. You can find 12 black students in Jackson, Mississippi to come to your school. You're not trying very hard. I withdrew from the search. And I think that was my first experience with the difference between being diverse and being welcoming. And I would say, and I know there have been questions about how I would approach this, so let me try with that. I think the head of school is the chief DEIBJ officer of the school, period. Whether or not we have somebody on full-time, whether we have consultants, it ultimately falls to the head to make sure that's going as well as it can be, and that's ongoing work. So, from George School and what I've learned about that, there's kind of an internal and an external piece to this. The internal piece is to make sure that we live up to the founding vision of the school, which is it is truly diverse and no one group dominates the school. It was actually something that came up yesterday with Don Soleil. And part of that is making sure we have the students here. So, I've worked with networks who, community-based organizations, churches, Jack and Jill, to try to widen the admission funnel at the top so that we have as many students coming from as many backgrounds as we can, coming into the school, looking at the place, deciding whether or not they want to be there, whether they want to apply. But I think getting that top of the funnel right is the first step. Once students are here, I think we have to be very conscious about not only being reactive, but being proactive. Are we teaching our community as a whole to be racially more literate? Are we helping them understand the experiences of LGBTQ people? Are we helping them understand the types of words and the types of things that people can say inadvertently that can be really hurtful? And are we equipping people to say, what you just said, actually, I heard it this way. Are we learning that vocabulary? And then what to do? Because I don't want people not to speak to one another. I think that, frankly, is a little bit of a cop-out in popular culture. I don't want to talk to people, you live with people, you need to talk with them. But I think it's also true that we need to be aware that the experiences of the people coming into this school are dramatically different, and not to make too many assumptions about that. That we're all, I mean, for all that I've just said that we're all the same, we're all different too. And how we reach that common humanity, I think, is very, very important. It also means doing things like what we started to do at George School when I left, and looking at the discipline process. You know, I had a dean of students, and she and I were talking, I was like, you know, it seems like a lot of black students are coming through our discipline process. You know, we hadn't been keeping track. You know, George School, if nothing else, had records about everything, except its finances, which was a whole other story. But we had, with our discipline process, we had, you know, the index cards for each thing that happened. So we started to go back through and say, can we, you know, do we remember, can we sort of tell what kind of a pattern there was? And the idea was to, going forward, be more cognizant of who's appearing in the discipline process, but also are there things in the process that are biased or are disfavoring some students that we need to take a look at and try to fix? And are there things in our community, around our community standards, that we need to be reinforcing as well? Because, you know, we really, and that's work they did after I left. But, you know, I wanted to set that up, and she wanted to set it up, because we were both just bothered by this impression we had. That's the sort of thing you do proactively where you can. Nothing is perfect. And the other thing is, if something is going wrong, you know, if you or your students are feeling like they're somehow being misunderstood or are being harmed in something, they have to tell us. And, you know, kids of a certain age will do that right away, and then others don't. You know, they will hold it. They may tell you. But if they tell us as adults, then we need to be able to follow through on that as quickly as possible. And I guess I would just sort of, I mean, make an editorial comment and move to the public part. You know, if you had asked me 10 or 12 years ago, you know, about sort of the presence of homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, I would have said a lot of it is pure ignorance. People don't know what they're saying. They don't know what they're doing. I have been alarmed by how intentional and hateful and open so much of that has turned out to be. There's plenty of ignorance, but that kind of thing, we cannot, I don't want New Roads to participate in. And which comes to the public part. You know, I would want our students to feel that they can go out into the world, it's part of the mission, to make a difference for the common good. And that can be activism, it can be service, it might be scholarship, but I want them to be ready to do that, and they have the courage to do it, and know that they have the school behind them. We're going to help them, they're students, they don't need to go do it on their own. And then we need to be good at it too. But I have been moved, actually, by what I've seen in this community over the past year. And the power for good in this place is, it's almost indescribable. But it does require us to be inclusive and to be very deliberate about that and welcoming, and for this place to be home for our students. And in a place that's so diverse, that's not always going to be easy, but it has to be home. And that is something I really want for the kids, because if they have that, then they can go and grow in different ways. But that comes back to the head, you know, and I'll get the help I need to make sure that we do that well.
It's also not lost on me. I just say that, yes, as someone who's leaving home, it's not lost on me either, the irony that again, that concept that was a true community-based, all of us are smarter than one of us, we have to reflect the fact that the perspectives here are also byproducts of Sam and I kind of, well, we kind of look alike, and we're dressed alike. and so anything that you know, I always am trying to be conscious of what it means to be part of a macro culture and recognize we're talking about issues of diversity, and everybody experiences the school in different ways. So it's never lost on me too that you know, you try the best you can to expand your perspective and never lose sight of what it kind of means to come from a place of privilege. And just want to say that as we think about our own perspectives up here. Again, thanks for coming. I appreciate those closing, but have we stepped in it in some way, or is there something that maybe didn't get brought up here, but you want some responses to? And yeah.
Staying along the concept of diversity, Sam, what was the acronym you used? It was
DEIBJ.
BJ.
Or JP.
Or JP. Yeah, the letters. Diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice.
Belonging and justice. So I added up the class.
And there, it seems like there are amalgams of that, right? Some people boil it down to DEI.
Okay. Got it. So staying along the lines of that, and you know, one of the things that I've always noticed being here at New Roads for the past like 8 or 9 years is even if the student body has become even more diverse every year, it kind of fluctuates, I'll see more or less, the staff hasn't. And that's a concern I have in terms of representation and, of course, just being able to relatability with teachers and stuff like that. As I have a black son going into a high school, and I've been told that there's one black teacher, and I don't know how many high school teachers there are, but I know there should probably be more than one if we're going to say it's diverse. In the sense that would make me feel comfortable, right? You know, there's a lot in that word. So with your experience in all your vast experience in progressive education, you found that it's been difficult to get black teachers in all these different schools and different places?
I'll try that. I'll try that first. It's a very good question. And I'll say my experience at George School was that different fields tend to attract more diverse candidates than others. So classics, for example, Latin, there aren't that many black classicists, though there are some. But on the other hand, if you're going to say student affairs, that actually is a really diverse, that should be a very diverse applicant pool. What I've done with searches at George School, and we try to start them early in the cycle when we know this is coming, is to take a scan early of the applicant pool. And I have said we're not going to proceed with the search until I see a more diverse pool, because I know it's there, So you're good search consultants, and I've used them. Go find them. Go see what we can do. What I resist doing, George School had a policy for a long time that made me uncomfortable. That said, we will advance one candidate of color to the finalist round of every search. And that can be okay, but what it also does is I worry about tokenism, and I worry about being really unfair to the people because if you have one person in a search, so one black candidate in a search, that person is going to end up as a finalist. Maybe they're great for the job, but maybe they're not, but they're still going to be there, and then if they're not, we pick somebody else. So what I want is that early stage to be diverse, so that we have a really well-qualified, diverse group of semifinalists and finalists. I think that's really important to me. I will say the harder thing was retaining the teachers, because really good teachers and really good administrators who come from non-white backgrounds are in great demand at schools. And their careers advance, which is great. And in fact, one of our George School teachers is now in San Antonio as a dean. They are constantly being recruited, which is fine, but it actually made the retention very, very difficult. So that was my experience too. So if you're in a school where people feel like they can do good work and where they can excel, they'll stay longer. But it's nice to see careers advance too. So.
I always, as I was listening to the question, and I appreciate Sam's comment. You always want to avoid PLEs. PLE, perfectly logical explanations, right? About why this. It's a great and complex question. A couple of things come to me as somebody who is involved in hiring in other organizations as well. Certainly, rivers of what Sam said runs through my answer here, but there is a sense of the culture of the school, examining the culture of the school, understanding what the life and experience is of someone who may have to walk by 15 of their colleagues before they see anyone that looks like them. What's that experience like for a child? and really being willing to have that discussion and being analytical, strategic, and pretty thoughtful about how it's interesting, the history of progressive ed, because I'm going to blank on this name, but there were strong African American progressive educators, but it was segregated, interestingly enough, and I can't remember the name of the book, but this question came up of, well, there are a lot of African American teachers at these schools, right, and not these schools, and I think even in 2026, it really requires us to release ourselves from biases and stereotypes and structures and systems, and really have the right to, before we even think about interviewing, before we even think about, what is our starting place within the school culture? What's the experience of somebody here? And I would say this about, I appreciate the nice way you said it, your vast experience, which is your beautiful way of calling me old. But I think this is a great. And I talked about the Shady Hill School, same for predominantly white faculty, and we couldn't understand how many kids. My friends who I made no longer wanted to go to the school, and it had to do with loneliness and isolation. And I love what Sam said about home. It's got to be home for everybody, including the professional staff. So it's really an examination and requires input from everyone, including the experience of families in the school, because that's going to be a connective tissue for the new employee, right, as well, right? It's an affinity group unto itself, and it requires that kind of, I think, discourse before we even launch the search about what that experience is like. I can go into a lot of other things about traditional schools and progressive schools, and I had a good friend, we were talking, and this was years ago, and he said, well, I'm going to come to your school, Dan, but I really would rather see the desk in rows, and the way I went to school, and if it's a leap of faith, if you think about it in early childhood, to go to a progressive school where the math classes, paper airplanes flying through the air, well organized and thoughtful, if it's a leap of faith and you're already in the macro culture, then from a marginalized perspective, it's even a more, I think, aggressive leap of faith. And I think the school has to embrace that right from the outset and engage in those discussions. And it's a great question. And loneliness, nobody feels great with that. And I think that includes faculty and staff, it includes families, and ultimately children as well.
Thank you. You're right. I mean, the culture of the school has to be welcoming. And this is where, you mentioned affinity groups on their end, this is where affinity groups can be helpful too. When you're talking, if you have affinity groups of faculty and staff or parents, how can we help your students feel at home? You'll hear that and you can share that with us, and that can be quite helpful to us.
And I think it doesn't just stop at faculty. I'm in the dominant group in this discussion, but I would imagine if I saw lead administrators, that would be comforting too. So it's hiring up and down the continuum, I would think, within that brings comfort and safety to that concept. Other things, yeah.
I wonder how much you guys in your preparations have discussed connections or counsel as a part of the curriculum, K-12, and sorry, it's too loud. What you think of that, as a cornerstone even, of all the things that you've discussed tonight around progressive education, restorative justice, empathetic learning, all of it, and how you see it, particularly Sam, sorry Dan, going forward.
And it is, I will admit, this is something we did not discuss in preparation for this evening. And I will say, forgive me if I get the terminology wrong. Is it council where students sit together? Okay. That, to me, and there's a question or a topic and they discuss it.
A prompt.
A prompt.
Yeah.
So this sounds to me a lot like a Friends meeting, a Quaker meeting. And I'm sure it's structured differently. What we learned and what I think students learned in those meetings, now they're in their silent, stereotypically silent meetings, but in fact people do speak during them. I think what our students learned, and I learned because it was my real first experience with that, what it's like to listen to completion and to think about what the person has said. And it gives you a chance to reflect on the individual and who they are, and what they said might mean to you. So often Quaker meetings have a prompt as well. They don't always. But you sit there until somebody feels moved to stand up and share something that's not only about themselves, but it's for the group, for everyone. And they speak and sit down, and you're not supposed to jump right up and have somebody else say something in response to you. Wait. And we had to teach that etiquette. But what we taught them was to listen. You know, to listen to completion and then to have that break. Now, that may not be exactly how things are structured here, but that capacity to listen is something that I think is incredibly important for all of us. And it's hard. I step on people's words all the time. I know that I do. But people will eventually finish their thought. And then when they do, it's okay to say, but no, to think, what does that mean? You know, it's okay to be centered, you know, and it's good to be centered sometimes before you respond or before you have something else to say. So it's kind of, I'm going to say it's a light answer to your question, but it is something that I think is very important in developing students' ability to listen, self-confidence, and to be taken seriously by their peers as well.
You could answer, Dan.
Thank you for taking over, lady. I appreciate it. No, you know, again, I'm a student of progressive ed. A lot of the stuff is, you know, in the cobwebs of my memory as an educator. But you know this book, Art of Gathering, that's out, right? Again, I come back to so many things kind of repeating from the early days of progressive ed, where even to this day, I did an interview at a friend's school, and I said, here's what we're going to do. For a half hour, the whole community sits there for a half hour. And if the spirit moves you, you speak. Now, a lot of you know me. And the concept of staying silent for a half hour, I'm like, I can never work here. You know, right? And another great Quaker story is my brother worked at Germantown Friends, which is nearby. And there was a 3-hour faculty meeting on whether through the dress code they should let students wear camouflage. And my brother was a relative. It makes me look serious. A new faculty member goes, I'm just trying to understand, are we worried we're not going to be able to see the students? So I think, but I'm only being, trying to be humorous, but it's a great question because in the early days, and you've seen, you probably heard, you know, morning meeting now, it grew out of responsive classroom. A lot of these ideas of gathering as a community and being able to listen. In your case, I thought it was great to completion, to be able to really tackle some issues either by prompt or by just spontaneity, really are very much tied to the earliest concept of actually coming from cultural understandings of something called kivas and certain things that sort of were adapted. And as you know, council is now alive and well in corporate U.S. So I think these are some of the most important lessons that grow out of that. Francis Parker School in Chicago, I think it still goes on, 1,200 people. They have a bigger theater. 1,200 people for the first half hour of every day get together. Kindergarten through 12th grade. And it is a pretty magical thing. And I think that that idea of how you gather, the reasons you gather, whether it be in a council to examine some of the deepest issues that are going on in the culture of childhood, or you gather as a community, sort of speak to that responsibility we have to connect with one another. Council, I think, has a very specific focus, and I think should never be diminished or dismissed as something that it may take different shapes and forms, but the concepts are very, I think, rich and meaningful. And I think even as a faculty, we should probably practice more of that as a professional community here.
Thank you for raising it, because it's something I've not had my eye on as much as some of the other aspects of the school, so I appreciate that a lot. And as a disclaimer, I do not like 3-hour faculty meetings. Don't see that in our future.
I have a question. I don't know if I need the mic. First of all, I love the coordinating outfits. Well done. As you prepare to take on this school, I mean, I'm a very type A person. I always think about what I want and how I'm going to get there. I'm sure you have a vision. When your tenure is over and you're making your final remarks, what are you thinking about as I left my mark on this school? What do you want your mark to be? Have you thought about that? Like, I'm leaving this school with this.
I have, and I reserve the right to change my mind as time goes on. So I have, the beauty of this school being 30 years old is that I've had the chance now to speak to the founders, who are alive. Bonzale was one of them, Paul Cummins and I have met, David Bryan and I have met. The mission of this school is in its simplicity and the passion with which these people have crafted it is remarkable. And I think number one is I don't want mission creep. But number two, more positively, I want the school to have the resources that it needs to meet its mission, so that the school can admit and support any student who wants to be here, who can thrive. So that, that means financial aid. It's most in tuition assistance, and it's most obvious. I want our faculty and staff to have the tools to meet the mission. And I want the campus to be developed in a way that supports the mission of the school and the vision of the school, the powerful vision of the school as well. So, defining by what I wouldn't want, I'm not saying to you, I want to build a palatial campus. I'm not saying that I want to have faculty who only have PhDs. I want people who care about the mission and the kids first, and for us to have the resources to support them. And I know the school has been through some challenging years. Not just with leadership, but financially, and they've, played themselves out in some of the curriculum and some of the things we're doing. I want to make sure those things don't happen again. And then, with that, and I said this to the faculty earlier this week, I want this school to compete proudly for students in LA. I think not only, and I know we speak a lot about the culture of the school, I want us also to be known as a remarkable academic institution.
Yes.
Because I think to have that strong culture, you need that. And I'm not afraid to compete. I am a competitive person. I tend to be very patient. But I'll to the point. But it's really important to me that when we talk about New Roads, the feeder schools say, yes, we have kids for you. Yes, we know enough about you. We're going to tell our families about the good things that are going on. It may, it's not going to be a school that's right for everybody. But there are students out there who I know can succeed here if we can support them, if we have the tuition assistance for them, if we have the faculty who are educated and oriented and trained to support them. And I think the SPARK program is remarkable for what it does, and it's an example of what could happen for non-SPARK students, that kind of support and excelling. But I want this place to be, when you say New Roads, people go, oh yeah, New Roads. You know, and when
They might do that now, but
Well-
different intonation.
it's funny, the people who know it do that.
Yeah.
You know, they do that. I have, by coincidence, of course, you know, I'm moving to Santa Monica from Philadelphia. My next door neighbor is a Rhodes graduate. And, you know, but he's sending his kids to public schools. They're actually at the public school. And I at some point, I'm going to ask about that. You know, I'm not going to ask quite yet. But I want to know about that decision. You know, I mean, it's expensive. You know, people will say that. But it would have been expensive when he went to. You know, it wasn't cheap. So I'm curious about those kinds of decisions. I want those decisions to be less. And the other thing I'll say in relation to that, I want more lifers. You know, students are welcome anytime they come into the school. But I want a few more who stay the whole way through. For families to find us earlier and stick around, I think that actually makes the school stronger.
And, you know, when Dewey started thinking about this and then his colleagues started expanding the discussion, it was progressive. He wasn't looking for less academics. Strong academics was the baseline. It was how that was shaped. He felt that that if you wanted to, I use this metaphor, you know, if you wanted to understand longitude and latitude, you can't learn that from page 28. You got to make a paper mache globe. You got to integrate with the art teacher, and you got to understand the curvature of the Earth in 3 dimensions. Now, it was messier, and it was, you know, some kids' globes look different than another kid's, but it was the constructivist nature of how intellect develops. I was, you know, progressives, they're not. That was never the idea of progressive education. I know it got sidetracked along the way and continues in some ways to get sidetracked. But the starting place, these were geniuses thinking about how the formation of intellect sort of develops over time. And the only thing I'd say, we'll take a question over here. For me, progressive education, not for me, but it is, you know, it is this incredible balance, and it so mirrors parenting between structure and freedom. It's the most kind of, you know, with parenting understand, you know, that it's sort of like structure and freedom. And kids might tell you specifically when there's too much structure. They may not say it the same way, but they will send you signals when there's too much freedom. And that's one of the delicate balances where I love, again, we come back to, now we're in this together. I'm absolutely convinced if we can't learn together, we can't live together. And there really is this sort of accordion nature of parenting that's no different, I think, in the nature and the fundamental core of progressive education.
I've got to just say one more footnote to something I said earlier, just to be clear. The measure of academic excellence is not how many of our students go to Stanford, to use a West Coast school, or Harvard, or Yale, and they're great schools, and they're the right schools for some people. But the measure of a strong academic institution is to say, you started here, and you ended up here. All of our students are going to start in different places. And the measure of excellence is not where they go to college and proud of what they do after school, after they leave here. But it is how sort of grounded they are, how self-possessed they are, how ready to think critically they are, and how ready they are to take on the world. That is excellent academics. It's not
Also, I just want to, in full disclosure, our idea of preparation is we saw each other in my office a few minutes before this, and you know, he looked at me and go, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, you okay?" So we prepared. That's how we prepared. So we recognize it's a little freestyle in here, but that was awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not looking at AI, I'm just perimenopausal, so. First, thank you for this time in approaching the questions about activism and diversity work and marginalized communities, and thinking about how those communities thrive here in this community. But with that, I wanted to ask what you're thinking on students who need support with multiple identities, be it race, neurodiversity, learning differences, social emotional challenges. What's your thinking on how to support those students and the faculty and staff, and supporting those students and making sure they thrive here and have a sense of belonging and stay here and become those lifers you're speaking to. Yeah.
Can I ask for clarification? Are you talking about, say, an individual student with multiple identities?
Multiple identities, yes.
Okay.
So a student who's a Black student, neurodivergent, social emotional challenges, and yeah, how do you see supporting those students?
I mean, you know, for me, again, drawing from prior experience, you know, I got to know the students myself, and you know, it was somewhat easier in a boarding school than it will be in a day school. But giving students an opportunity to express themselves, whoever they are, as people, is, I think, very important, so that they can feel heard, they can feel, you know, if they have questions, they can ask questions, and you know, they can sort of stake out who they are in that way. Now, when it comes to institutional supports, you know, I think I'll have to see how well integrated those supports are here. I don't know yet. I mean, I know Spark is one thing, and you know, sort of academic support is pretty well developed. I come from a school that had affinity groups, and there wasn't a kind of a membership. It was interesting because the Umoja, the Black student group, actually talked about this. Should there be a kind of a membership requirement? You know, do you have to be Black to be in Umoja? And you know, they sort of said, well, you know, no, you know, it was a fascinating conversation. I was there, I just listened, because they recognized people, you know, came from multiple backgrounds, from many backgrounds, and they should feel welcome there. So I think the student affinity groups can be really helpful in helping us understand what students need. That particular group was really thoughtful, and they were helpful to me, and I visited them several times when I was there, especially in my earlier years. Students were free to form new groups, you know, so there wasn't a set menu. As the leadership kind of went one way or the other, you know, a new group might crop up. We were pretty supportive of that as well. We did have a fairly robust student government, and that helped as well. I mean, the student government tended to step in and sort of, you know, advocate for students, but also sort of defend the students and the need for the groups when that came up. I think I've heard several people ask for a student government here, and so that might have something to do with it. But I think, you know, the bottom line to me is to listen to the student and the family about the needs and see where we can meet them, and then to grow the resources where we need to. Because I don't want students to feel conflicted about who they are. I want them to feel comfortable with who they are. But having multiple identities is, you know, there's still one identity that's you.
Just in addition to that, and Dan, I definitely want to hear from you as well, informing the larger community as well, like what can that look like? So everyone is aware we're a village and we're supporting one another in all areas and layers and perspectives.
You know, it's interesting, when you're talking about individual students or a small group of students, I would, and depending on how old they are, I would actually want to talk with them about how to do it. Because I think, and again, my experience with this has mostly been with high school students, or college students. College students care about this a little less. High school students really did. They had their peers. And so they didn't want the school to behave in ways that made them feel singled out. And so, you know, I would want, I think, to talk with the students and say, you know, how would you like to approach school-wide support? My experience the first time is they say, oh, no, you know, you don't need to do anything at all. You know, and then you ask the second time, does actually here are things that, you know, we really need. So, you know, I would like to think New Roads, you know, everybody is welcoming all the time, but they are teenagers at that level, and they're younger and they're in middle school. And those are rough years, and so I would want to be really sensitive to the dignity of the student in whatever we do. not a full answer, but that's kind of where I would start.
Yeah, I think my answer comes back to school culture. I love the question about multiple identities, because when you think about really dynamics of power, maybe you're in one room you're in a dominant position, in another room you're in the subordinate, and that ability to, as a culture of the school, to recognize and to honor, again, this agility in the culture of the school, so that multiple identities and the examination that really turn into multiple opportunities to really understand one another and to understand what kids and adults are going through, right? Because the adult community can play out that way to a certain degree. And so really I think that the great question about multiple identities is how good are we, or how good any school is and should be in that cultural reality that that issues of identity require us to examine dynamics of power in every setting, if we're really truly going to be inclusive, right? I mean, I think the great thing about progressive school, and maybe you heard me say this, to me, great schools kind of always try to find this perfect line between love and achievement. And I think we can be somewhat fooled by schools that solely err on the side of love, and we've seen the damaged schools that you can do to, on the achievement side. I think we always have to be looking for that intersectionality, and the only way to do that, I think, is to recognize exactly how those dynamics play out for power. We kind of understand it as adults, but kids are starting to figure it out all the time, and they're testing it out, and it can have incredibly loving and powerful implications, and it can have complicated and harmful ones. So I think it requires us to think, again, horizontally as much as vertically. How we doing, all right? Okay, yeah. Yeah. I also want to point out that I've noticed that I'm on my way out, so I have the microphone that looks like it was in a dryer. He has the go ahead.
It can be challenging. My name is Isa. My wife and I are lifers with our son Alan here since kindergarten. How many lifers we got? Anybody else? Oh man, sorry. Yeah, I see Lady and Jason. I think that the school has to decide and make it known that it is publicly and proudly anti-bigoted, right? And when I say bigoted, really what I want to say is anti-racist. I think that it goes unnoticed just how profoundly anti-Black America is, and I think that it's easy to overlook it if you're not Black. It's just you don't ride your bike 2 weeks ago on a Sunday and somebody yells out, you already know. The week before that, another, and it's middle-aged, and it started when I was 10, and it hasn't ended. And so that is a big deal to see that reality and to know it and to experience it here at New Roads for the first time was so deeply disappointing because we knew that we were in a place where that wasn't, we were in the bubble. And so when I say loudly and proudly, when we applied to New Roads, I wrote in the application that we were unapologetically Black. And I said, Alan is going to contribute as much to this school as an individual as you all will get out of him as a diverse standing. And what's wrong with saying I'm anti-racist? Because if you're not anti-racist, what are you? Are you neutral? What happens when my son and his friends go out and one of them is viewed with suspicion, and there's one reason for it? And are his friends and his peers aware of that? They should be, and they must be. And the same discomfort that he experiences, they won't experience the same, but it will not be zero. And so I think it's important to really be unafraid of being anti-bigoted loudly. And so I wanted to just make that statement. We dance around a lot of words and kind of mantras, but like, what are you? Are you really standing for? You know, it's like the affinity groups, right? The affinity group doesn't form because we seek out an affinity group. It forms because we seek out camaraderie, and we seek out belonging, and we seek not sameness, but usness. It doesn't mean that there's a counter affinity group. It doesn't mean that it's unwelcoming. It means that there's a purpose for its being, and the purpose is supporting those who know what your life is like. Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that you have to have a Blue Lives Matter. It's offensive. It's not the point. So I just wanted to make that statement as Alan enters high school. You know, I want him to go to school like, this is my home. And these are the reasons why. Because everybody around me loves me for the human that I am. I'm Alan first, and all the rest is incidental. Can't help how you're born, you know. And you shouldn't have to excuse it. It's not a question.
Thanks for those comments, and all relevant to much of the discussion tonight. So thank you, and I'll miss you too. So thank you for the statement, and maybe I am taking my leave of the school, and I'll just say a couple of things, since it's great to see many of you who have come to know, and just how remarkable the parent and adult community is here, how much I love the kids. I've gotten to know some, and sorry that I didn't know everyone as deeply as I would in a child-centered school. If you think about that, I would encourage the school to keep having. I love what you're kind of. It's easy to turn away, right? It's harder to find the truth and justice and raise these kids in a way that can only try to improve some of the things your opening comments alluded to. No one is born racist. No one is born classist. No one's born homophobic. Most of my second half of my life is unlearning all the lessons I learned the first half of my life. And that's the role schools can play much earlier. I think if we really want to be the society we hope to be. I was asking somebody about it. I got emotional with the faculty as I was saying goodbye, and I sort of, classically immediately called somebody who was a psychotherapist to ask why. And she said, it's like a boat passing a bank, and you're stepping off, but you absolutely are committed to the boat continuing. And I thought it was a good metaphor. So as I step off the boat and welcome a different captain into it, I want to thank you all for continuing to try to fight the good fight, trying to be absolutely grounded in moral courage. And it's just been an amazing chapter in my life to be here. So thank you very, very much for letting me stop by. And you're amazing good fortune to have my new friend and colleague, Sam, with you. And I don't know if you want to close out. Is there wine?
I said it earlier, I've been inspired by getting to know so many of you. And, there's almost limitless good I feel in this school. And I think the job that we have is to draw that out and to put it to work for our students and for society as a whole. I have had I've had some experience, and I've changed jobs a lot. I've been in Franklin and Marshall for some. But, this has been one of the most thoughtful, high quality sort of transitions in leadership that I have ever seen, and certainly that I've experienced. You know, I feel like I'm among friends. And that we have a lot of really good work to do together. And, you know, Dan, you set that up. I mean, you and this community, for the past 2 years, have done something incredible. And, you know, if nothing else I bring to the school, I want to bring stability and the kind of growth that can honor what everyone here has done over these past couple of years, and to honor the mission of the school going back as well. So you've done a great job. So I want you to know how grateful I am and how much I enjoy your company.
Thank you very much. That's a college professor, that's too affirmative. I had a question about, 10 years from when Sam, there's a statement among heads of schools that say you really know your culture's changed when your youngest students, when you graduate. That's how long it takes to shift a culture. And that can be, it's very different in a junior high that has a 7th and 8th grade, but K through 12, it's a journey. And thanks, Sam. And again, it's been a true pleasure. And I hope to come back and see all the things that were alluded to. So my love to you all. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.